Hello, my name is Jason Demora, and welcome back to By Faith Bible Studies. This will be my second and last sermon in the month of March. Really excited to not preach for the rest of the March because I'm busy, as well as we're going to be having some guest speakers on here. Really going to be a fantastic time allowing some of my friends to get into the book of Ecclesiastes. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, that may not actually happen, but I'm hoping for the best that these friends of mine will be able to jump on here and be able to preach on Ecclesiastes and share their views on Ecclesiastes 5, 6, and most of 7. Really going to be a good time looking through those chapters. But today we're in chapter 4. And chapter 4 is part of a I saw section, a studying section that Solomon does. We see this beginning in chapter 3, verse 16, where he says, "Furthermore, I have seen under the sun." And then in chapter 4 it starts with, "And I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun." And in verse 7 it says, "Then I looked at vanity." Verse 4 it says, "I have seen." And moving forward, it keeps having this theme of seeing, this idea that Solomon is looking out at the world, and these are the things that he sees. And he sees them, and he is making statements about them, especially in a fallen world. We're really looking at this theme of what it means to live in a fallen world. Last time we looked at death and injustice in light of time, and this idea of that because we live in a fallen world, there is death and there is injustice. Even though God marks over that morbid canvas with a masterstroke of sovereignty, that it is all beautiful in His plan, death and injustice are still real and still hard to grasp and understand. Today, we are looking at relationships, human relationships, and friendship as the center stone of those relationships. So as I read Ecclesiastes 4, I want this question to be on your mind. How do I rightly look at friendship in a fallen world? Let me read. Ecclesiastes 4. "Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead, more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is under the sun. I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked. And for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity, and it is a grievous task. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, 2 can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with them, for this too is vanity and striving after wind." This is the word of the living God. Let us pray. Dear Lord, as we look at this passage and we look at a fallen world, Lord, help us to understand what friendship means in a fallen world and how we can live for you and live for others in a fallen world. Lord, give me wisdom as I address this passage, and give wisdom to the listeners as we reflect on the hardships of a fallen world, but also the great gifts that you have given, especially in friendship. Amen. Excuse me. Before we jump into Ecclesiastes 4, it's important to get some background. As I spoke about in chapter 3, there is a lot of references to the fall of man, and before the fall of man, Eden. And as we looked in chapter 3, we looked at that verse, from dust to dust, which was a reference to the fall that speaks about death and how Adam would go from dust to dust. And in Ecclesiastes 4, we look at the fall of man in reflection of Eden and the Genesis 3 again. So before we get in there, I have to look at a couple passages. There are two things that we have to look at in Genesis before we get into Ecclesiastes 4, and those are work or labor and friendship. Labor and friendship. Or, if you like the two L's, labor and loneliness. Labor and loneliness. So let's turn to chapter 2 of Genesis. This is before the fall of man. Chapter 2. And we're going to look at starting at verse 15. And I'm just going to read this whole passage to pretty much the end of the chapter. Then Yahweh God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely. But from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. Out of the ground Yahweh God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle, and to the birds of the sky, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper suitable for him. So Yahweh God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs, and closed the flesh at that place. Yahweh God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man, and brought her to the man. The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, this passage is first, most, and explicitly about marriage, but what is marriage but it is a devout and close-knit friendship. And so we can apply this passage in one sense to friendship. And as we look at before the fall, I think something that is fascinating is that in Genesis 1 it says, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good. But then when he comes to man and he sees that man does not have a friend, that man is alone, he sees that it is not good. It says in verse 18, then Yahweh God said, it is not good. And what's very important to understand that this is from God's perspective, not Adam's perspective. Adam had not fallen. Adam was perfect. Adam did not even really know that he was alone or lonely. But before even Adam could experience this sense of loneliness, God gave him Eve so that he would not be alone. But notice how this verse and this idea of Adam getting a friend, getting a wife in Eve, is in the midst of labor and work. That God gives Adam the gift of labor. He allows him to work in the Garden of Eden. He calls him to name all of the animals and to rule over all creation. Adam is given work to do, and it is a blessing from God. And notice how Eve is not mentioned here as a friend. She is not mentioned here as a wife, first most. She's mentioned as a helper. A helper. And once again, we're not talking about subordinate, how women are subordinate to men or anything like that, because it's, first of all, not true. But that's not why he uses the word helper. The word helper here is used because Eve is a helper to Adam in labor, and Adam is a helper to Eve in labor, and they work together in a perfect world in friendship. And this idea that labor and friendship are closely knit, because in the perfect world, that is how it was done. Adam and Eve worked together to work for the Lord. This then brings us to Genesis 3, verses 16 through 24. Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, we have the fall of man, and the curses that are given to the woman and given to the man. Those are the ones that I want to read, and I want you to notice these curses and what these curses are on mankind. the first and foremost curses in Scripture. Verse 16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground, because from it you are taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So, what are the first three curses really given here to the woman and then to the men? The first we have is broken friendship. Look at the end of verse 16. Yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. This is not talking about how women are subordinate to men. That's not the point here. Now, that's a much different dynamic and a dynamic for a completely different sermon. But what I want to get out of that verse right now is this contention between the sexes, contention between all people. This idea that there would no longer be labor in perfect harmony. That one would want what the other has, that there would be contention, that there would be fighting, and that there would not be unified rule anymore. That Adam would want something that Eve has, and Eve would want the power that Adam has, and they would have contention. Here, friendship is broken. And then as we look at the curse that's given to Adam, hard work is put into life. Labor that was initially a gift from God and still is a gift from God is now cursed, and it is hard. And there are thorns and thistles and sweat and toil. It is hard work that now Adam has to do. A gift that was from God is now cursed and tampered with by the fall. And then thirdly we have, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. This death that will come. So now we live in a fallen world, no longer perfect, that is defined by broken friendships, hard work, and all of it spiraling towards death. This is the curse. Notice that the biggest curses given here are broken friendships and hard work. Why does God chose these curses to be exemplified here? Because they are so important. Because we are social people. We are called to be with people. And we are working people, be it at work or at school or wherever it may be. We are working people. We want to work, but work is now hard. And friendships are broken, and it all leads to death. So now that we have the theology, the basis of labor and the basis of friendship into our minds, let us go back to Ecclesiastes 4. And as we look at Ecclesiastes 4, I'm going to be splitting it into three sections. And the first two of these sections are looking at the contrast between a lonely set of people and a set of people who have friends. And so I'm going to label this first section, verses 1 through 8, Loneliness Hurts. Loneliness hurts. This is what it means to live in a fallen world without anyone. And as we look at loneliness, the verse 3 verses give us our first set of lonely people. Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. And at the side of the oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them. Notice how he doesn't focus too much on the oppression, and that is not what he repeats here, because in verse 16 of chapter 3, he talked about how there is injustice where there should be justice, and there is wickedness where there should be righteousness. That's not his point here. Now he takes that point that he already has made, and he makes it on a personal level, saying that those people who have injustice towards them have no one to comfort them. The oppressed have no one. In a fallen world, the strong hurt the weak, and the weak have no say in the matter, and they are hurt, and they are in pain, and they are lonely, because they have no one to comfort them. And as we go into verses 2 and 3, some of the most dark verses in the entire book of Ecclesiastes, We have to understand the context. We can't take these verses out of context. And the context is oppression. The context is that Solomon goes here, and Solomon has this thought because of people. And that life is miserable in this sense because of people. So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. This is a really, really dark place to go, and it's very important to understand that as he said this, it is from a godless perspective. Solomon understands that if you believe in God and you have God and you live for God, there is reason to live. To live is Christ, as Philippians says. That's not what he's talking about. He's not countering that. Rather, he's saying that if there is no God, and if the oppressed are oppressed, then why don't we just take our own lives? Or better yet, I wish I had never been born. This is Solomon's viewpoint, and it counters the philosophical thought that it is better to live miserable than to be dead. He says, no, I'd rather be dead. And this leads us to go, well, there goes every single argument against suicide, every single argument against wanting to take your own life. It's all gone because Solomon says here, I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living, but better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun. And what leads him here? Evil people. People have caused this evil. He sees the oppression and he goes, look at them, they have no one to comfort them. They have no one. It would be better that they were not even alive. From a godless perspective. Now, once again, we have God and we know that there is a God, and Solomon knows that there is a God, and so no, suicide is absolutely not the answer. And wishing you had never been born is absolutely not the answer. But if there is no God, then it seems like that is the answer. But even knowing that there is a God, and even knowing that there is a reason to live, and that reason is to glorify Him, as we've looked at in the past few chapters, it still leads us often to this place of utmost depression that is caused by evil people oppressing us, or watching other people be oppressed. I think it's powerful that Solomon gives this statement, because Solomon was definitely not oppressed. Yet he saw it. He witnessed it in his kingdom. And even by looking at them, he thought to himself, how hard this world is, how evil people are. The oppressed have no one. Verses 4 through 6 then look at the world of work, the working world, and at working people. I got these terrible allergies, sorry about that. Verses 4 through 6, the working people. And this leads us back to Eden and back to this idea of labor that has been cursed because of the fall. I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. How true is this statement? Labor is it's not really about serving God anymore. It should be, but really it's about rivalry. It's about being better than other people. It's about envy. It's this idea that I want what my neighbor has, and so I'm going to work hard so that I can get to the place where my neighbor is and I can have what they have. And then once you get there, you realize, oh, it wasn't actually that great. Look at this other guy, my other neighbor. Let's see if we can work hard enough to get what he has. And it's this sense of rivalry and this fighting for what you want, what you will never get, and that is satisfaction. The working people will never be satisfied because there will always be someone who is better. There will always be someone who is greater. This is the power of envy in the workplace. This constant want to have more, to have something that someone else has, and a constant realization that you will never be there. You will never get there because this too is vanity and striving after the wind. What they have you may get, but you'll just want something more after that. The power of envy in the working place. And it leads us to this idea that the worker wants no one. The oppressed have no one, and the worker wants no one. They don't want any friends, they want their friends' stuff. They want to beat them. And if that doesn't work, Solomon gives this other idea about work. In verse 5, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. This idea of the anti-worker, the one who doesn't work at all. If work is just about rivalry, why even try? I'd rather sit in my couch and watch television all day. But he, in this grotesque image of this idea that the lazy man is too lazy to even feed himself, starves to death where he consumes his own stomach and dies. This is the folly of laziness. Do not sit around waiting for death to come to you. Labor is a gift from God, and it is still a good thing, though it be cursed in a fallen world. We saw this in chapter 3, where it said repeatedly, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. This call to work. It says in verse 24 of chapter 2, there is nothing better for a man to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I've seen that it is from the hand of God. Labor is a gift from God, and it is a good thing. Do not sit around being lazy. And once again, the lazy person does not want anyone. They want to be alone with their stuff, and they want to live in squalor and laziness. So what is the opposite of laziness? That would be the workaholic, the person who lives for work, the person who loves work to an extent that they should not. And Solomon says to that, one handful of rest is better than two fistful of labor and striving after wind. This idea that working too hard will not allow you to ignore death. And that working to an extent that it is the entirety of life is a exact opposite of what God has called us to do with work. Work was supposed to be for Him, to live for Him, but we have caused it so that it is not, and that it is something for ourselves. You can't beat death by ignoring it and living for work. You can't beat death by sitting around lazily and waiting for it to grab you. And you can't beat it by working and envying what your friend has and trying to be better than them. The worker wants no one. They want to live for themselves, either be it in work or lack of work. Solomon uses work as a symbol in here to show how important work is and how connected it is with people. That often we work for people, under people, or against people. But here, in this dark tone on it, we work for ourselves. He works for themselves, and they want no one. The oppressed have no one, the worker wants no one, and now we look at the rich people. When I say the rich people, I don't mean that riches are bad, rather I mean this idea of the one who lives for riches and riches alone. That is where the sin creeps in and takes your life. Then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches. This person has no one. He has no dependence. He has no one he's living for. And this person, the rich, they need no one. They don't need the support of someone. They don't need the comfort of someone like the oppressed need. They don't even need someone so that they can beat them and work harder than them because they've succeeded. He has everything. He has riches. He has glory. He has fame. They have everything, and the rich need no one, or at least they think they need no one. But what they don't realize is that if all those works are lost, it's all going to be gone, and that it is vanity, and there's a striving after wind. We looked at this in chapter 2, that riches, all of his riches are going to be gone. And so what is Solomon's response to that when he says here, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? He never even realized that he had no one, because he didn't seem that he needed them. But loneliness is not good. Genesis 2:18, as we looked at earlier, shows us this. That is, he's going to lose all of his treasures. He's not going to be able to leave anything behind because he had no wife to care for. He had no children to care for. He had no friends to live for. And everything is gone. His stuff is gone. And he had no one to live for. The rich seem like they need no one. What they don't realize is their riches will not fulfill them. And this is vanity, and it is a grievous task. It is good to live for someone. Adam lived his life before the fall, entirely devoted to God, and secondly, devoted to his wife. And Eve devoted her entire life before the fall to God, and secondly, to Adam. They loved each other, they worked for each other, and they gained riches in the world for each other. And there was joy in that communion. Look at the Trinity. It is the same idea. That God does not only live for himself, but he lives for the Trinity and the other two parts of himself, so that he has someone to love, someone to live for, someone to care for, and that is himself, but at the same time, it is this loving triune body where they work for each other in friendship and love from eternity past to eternity future. We are not supposed to be alone. And the oppressed who have no one in a fallen world are hurt and have no one to comfort them. And it's hard. And they can't even work because there is no work left for them because it is taken by the oppressed and they are, it's taken by the oppressors and they are oppressed. And the working people, they want no one. They have work, but they try to throw it off at times when they are lazy, or they try to hold on to it as hard as they can, but that doesn't work either. And they want no one. And the rich, they need no one. And it is all of these people who, for different separate reasons, have no one to live for. Their labor is insignificant. They have no friends. They have no God. And they live in a fallen world, and it's hard. And there's oppression. And there's lack of want to work at all. And there's a realization that all you gain from your work will be lost. And it causes you to go, why would I work at all? I have no one, I have no God, and my labor is insignificant. I listened to a sermon on this passage from Tom Patton, and he said this, and I think this is very powerful. Labor causes man to search for significance. Significance that can only be found in God. Let's go back to Genesis for half a moment. Why did Adam and Eve work before the fall? They worked because God told them to work, and they worked for God. Labor was their way to have significance, not through their labor, but through God who had given them that labor so that they could work for him. Labor causes man to search for significance. The oppressed people are looking for a reason to live, but they cannot find it. The working people are learning that their work is fruitless and they might as well be lazy. And the rich people are realizing that all of their riches will be lost and that that's not significant either, because not only do they not have any friends, but the oppressed and the worker and the rich, they have no God. And that friendship and working for other people leads always upwards towards God. What did I say just a moment earlier? Adam worked for his wife, but he worked for God first and foremost. That they both work together for God. That it is always God focused and that he gives the significance. And labor is merely a byway to get to God and a way to get to him and live for him. Labor is good. But it must be for God, and it must not be the soul of our significance. And it must be with or for other people, because it is not good to work alone. It was not good for Adam to work alone. And this ends our section in this idea that loneliness hurts. And it leads us to verses 9 through 12, where we see that teamwork heals. If loneliness hurts, then in a fallen world, teamwork heals. Let me read verses 9 through 12. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. What a strange place for a passage on friendship. In the midst of Ecclesiastes, in the midst of the hard times, in the midst of the trials of life, what does Solomon throw at us? A passage on friendship. Doesn't that lead you to go, friendship must be important. It must be. Or why else would it be in this book, this particular book that talks about the greatest questions of life, of death, of purposelessness, of a seeming meaninglessness of our own existence? What does Solomon throw in there? In chapter 4, friendship. We need friends. We need friends. This is a fallen world, and we need friends. It leads us back to the garden once again. How could Adam and Eve, how were they supposed to live after the fall? Well, they were supposed to still live for each other. And they were supposed to still live for God. And they were supposed to still labor and be fruitful and multiply. They were supposed to still work, be it not in perfection, but desperately trying to get back to perfection, which in essence is sanctification, understanding that in the future, in heaven, there will be perfection once again. So what did that mean for Adam and Eve? What does that mean for us? It means labor, and it means labor with other people. It means cultivate the earth, work for God, but not alone, because life is hard. And 2 are better than 1. 2 are better than 1. This first verse shows us literally to literally complete more labor than 1 person. But it's more than that. It's this idea that if you work for yourself, that's all you're working for. But if you work for someone else, that you have that loving relationship with someone else, that you work for them and they work for you, then there is so much more good return in your labor there. You don't believe me? Maybe you should just live for yourself. Well, look at the past few passages that we just looked at. Solomon is showing you that working for yourself doesn't work. It's sad, insignificant, and lonely. It is better to work for someone else and have them work for you and live in this loving relationship. And this is not just talking about marriage, and this is not just talking about paying the bills. This is talking about every labor of life, sharing the gospel, going to school, anything that it is, going through the trials of life. They are all work, they are all hard, they are all times when we feel like we are oppressed or lazy or like workaholics, or like our riches and our gains have been fruitless. There are always these times, and that's why we need people, for that when we fall, they will lift us up. We need those friends in our lives to catch us when we fall. Those people that will be there to keep us warm. Looking at verse 11, furthermore, if 2 lie down together, they keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? This is talking literally about that if it's cold, people will huddle together to keep warm. It's like a thing that people do in a survival setting. And I love how he uses that, because how much are we in a survival setting in a fallen world? We are trying to survive outside of Eden, outside of perfection, because we have sinned. Let me say that again. We have sinned. Stop looking out at the evils of the world and going, they are so evil, we need to survive. Rather, look at yourself and realize you are sinful. I am a sinner. And that is why when I sin, when I fall short, when I go against God's plan, I need someone to catch me and read the Bible to me, to pray for me. When I am cold in this fallen world, I need someone to keep me warm. And when the devil is overpowering me, when I am alone, I need a friend who can help me resist the devil. This is not talking about Jesus. This is not talking about God, although we will get there in a moment. This is talking about friendship. I'm reflecting back on the beginning of this chapter. You have to have a God-centered attitude when you look at these verses, because without God, it would be better to not be alive at all. But with God, it is good to be alive. It is good to labor for Him and live for Him. And the way that you labor for him and you live for him is only possible when you do it with other people. When you live together with other people. When you love other people. When you have someone to catch you when you fall. When you have someone to keep you warm when you are cold. And someone to fight for you when you are hurting and overpowered. This last section, a cord of 3 strands, is not quickly torn apart. Is not talking about marriage. It's not talking about 2 strands and the center strand is Jesus. That's not what it's talking about. It's literally talking about 3 people are better than 2 and 2 people are better than 1. But I love this idea of a cord, a rope. Because I was in Scouts for a while and we encountered rope a lot. And what would happen is rope would fray a lot of the time. And when rope frays, it's useless and pointless. And when the cord is by itself, it's not strong at all. However, when you tie the cord together with those 3 strands, tighten them together, it is so much stronger and so much more powerful. And that when it frays, we would you would tie it back together, or you would melt, if it was synthetic, you'd melt the cords back together. And when I apply this to friendship, it's this idea of keeping those friendships strong. When they fray, pulling them back together, not allowing those strands to break apart. Understanding that a cord of 3 strands is important, that friendship is important, and that we need friendship. And that when we are oppressed, when we realize that work is painful, when we understand that the outcome of our work, our physical outcome, our temporal outcome is fleeting and just striving after when we need someone who is Christian. If you are a Christian, you need a friend who can pick you up, who can drag you when you can no longer walk. There is a need for the church. There is a need for Christian friendship. There is a need for people to hold on to each other. This is why we have the church. I think about the character of Paul. Paul was not married, and that's what leads me to go, well, this definitely is not about marriage, because Paul was not married. He did not have a wife, and he actually gives a whole passage about why he chose singleness, and that's another story for another day. But what did Paul have? He had the churches who cared for him both in prayer and sometimes physically, and he cared for them, and he loved them, and he lived for them. Yes, Paul was able to get through all of his trials because God was there for him, but he was also able to get through all of his trials because his friends were there for him, and his friends cared for him, and he cared for his friends. When he fell, they picked him up. When he was cold, they kept him warm. And when he was feeling overpowered, they were there for him. And vice versa, when they were falling short, he was there for the churches. This need for Christian friendship. And I titled this section Teamwork Heals because I think it's connected back to work again. This idea that labor and friendship is something that happened before the fall. And so to defy the fall and fight against the curse and instead fight for God with a heavenly focus looking towards the future, we need to continue working, and we need to work with other people and for other people. This leads us to verses 13 through 16, which are some of the most confusing words I have read in Ecclesiastes so far. And there's actually different interpretations of these verses because it's so confusing, and different translations will actually say different things and interpret the story differently, and different commentaries will say different things. Some people even think that it is explicitly talking about the story of Joseph. Some people think it's talking about David. But I think the way to look at it is stop getting yourself stuck in the weeds, and we need to look at it the best we can, understanding that I think the story is very confusing, but the point of the story is actually very clear. And it is not a historical piece that is here. It is just a parable that Solomon is giving. And so what is it about? Well, I would call verses 13 through 16 a qualifying statement. A qualifying statement. And I think if we look at this way in relationship to the rest of what he said in chapter 4, it'll make sense, and it'll say something that is very important and very hard to read, but powerful at the same time. So I'm going to read it again, and then we're going to try to explain what is going on here. A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with them, for this too is vanity and striving after wind. In this first verse, we have a poor yet wise lad, and we have an old foolish king. So we have two characters here, a poor kid and a old foolish king. And the wise lad listens to instruction, and the foolish king does not listen to instruction. And so this is a first call, obviously, to listen to warning and admonition, that those are good things. And then we have verse 14, which is very confusing. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he is born poor in his kingdom. And this actually literally has different grammatical interpretations, but I think the best way to look at it is that both of these are talking about the poor yet wise lad. That somehow he used his wisdom to go from prison to the kingship. And he actually takes the kingship from the king, and he becomes king. So the old man loses the kingship, and the young lad gets the kingship. And then it says here, I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. So all of the people come and live for the lad and support him. It's like a political uprising that he takes the kingship, and all of the people that once supported the king are now supporting this new taker of the throne. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them. And they're all going to this new lad. And it says here, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him, for this too is vanity and striving after wind. And what he's trying to say here in this last verse, which is very confusing, I'll be honest, is this idea that when the lad came up and took the kingship from the king, all of the people who were supporting the king ran over to the lad. And eventually someone else would take the throne, and all the people would run from him all the way over to that person. And back and forth the people run, supporting whoever the next king is. And this too is vanity and striving after wind. What he's showing here is the story of political power, that you can never hold on to political power long enough. But why is he sharing this story here? And this is the point. Two things. First of all, that good friends are there to give warning and admonition, and that you need good friends. Notice in verses 9 through 12 that it only goes up to 3. It says 2 friends or 3 friends, as in the 3 strands, but it never goes any higher. And what he's trying to say here is that it is important to have friends. But it's not important to have 1,000,000 friends. The king had 1,000,000 friends, he still lost the kingdom. The lad had 1,000,000 friends, but he still lost the kingdom eventually, and it was still vanity and striving after the wind. You need good friends, and good friends in verses 13 through 16 are defined as ones who will give instruction to this poor yet wise lad. The people who are wise and care for each other in admonition as well, and give warning. The foolish king did not have anyone like that. But the other part of this is that no matter how many friends you have, you will be forgotten, and they will forget you, and they will move on. And maybe this is because you have a ton of friends and they're not real friends, and we understand how that works when you've probably experienced it, when you realize that just wasn't a good friend and they weren't a real friend, and eventually they leave you. And they leave you to work alone in a fallen world, and it's sad and lonely. But there's also those good friends. There's ones that are there with you through the hardest of times. Well, the truth is that when you die, the chances that they'll still be alive are very slim. And you might lose that good friend, that one you love so dearly, to death. Or you might move across the country and never see them again. This is the reality of the world, and he shows this story to say this and to qualify his statement about friendship. To say that friendship does not fix the fallen world. It heals, but it does not seal the wound, because friends fail, and friends fall short. And friends will not always be there to keep you warm, and they will not always be there to catch you. And it is vanity and striving after the wind to have friends at all. That is what Solomon is saying here. So how can he say that after everything he's just said? Oh, he's made this argument about how hard it is to be lonely, and then said that we need friends. How can he now say that it doesn't matter how many friends you have, you'll lose all of them, and it's a striving after the wind? His point is this, is that vanity does not mean meaninglessness, as we talked about earlier. It's this idea of shortness. And striving after the wind does not mean meaninglessness either. It's this idea of trying to have control. You will never have control. And friendship is good, but it is not the answer. It is not the answer. But it is very, very good. And we need friends in a fallen world because it is a fallen world. But friends are not perfect. And we do not live in a perfect world. So this leads us to our conclusion. And I have two applications of chapter 4 that I think are going to be very helpful for us. Two applications. I'm first going to look at the outward application. And for that, we're going to turn to Matthew 22. Each of these applications will be turning to the Gospels, because Ecclesiastes is a very harsh and hard text, and I think it's important at times to ease it with the beauty of the Gospels. Matthew 22, verses 37 through 39. It reads this. And he said to him, as in Jesus said to this person, I will go back to verse 36, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? Somebody is asking Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And he said to him, Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. A direct reference to Deuteronomy. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And what this is saying here is he's summarizing all of the Torah into two statements. The first is to love God first, and to love others as God commands it. And so my outward application as we look at Ecclesiastes 4 is to love others. Be that friend who catches somebody, your friend, when they fall. Be that friend who can keep somebody warm when they are cold. Be that friend who can fight against the devil alongside them and pray for your friends. Be that friend. Love others because God has commanded it. Love God first, then love others. Going back to the garden. In perfection, Adam was friends with Eve, and Eve was friends with Adam, and they loved each other, but who else did they love? They loved God. And they were in a friendship with God. And so that first they lived for God and they devoted their lives to God, and then secondly they loved each other. This is the outward application. Be that friend. Understand that people are oppressed. Understand that people are lost in the working world, and understand that the riches of this world are fleeting, and people are realizing that every single day. Be that friend who is there to teach the gospel, to preach the gospel, to love, to care, to give admonition, and to catch you when you fall. I'm so grateful for all of my friends who do this for me, who pray for me, who love on me, who make sure that when I am in those dark times, when I feel oppressed, and when I am quoting verses 2 through 3 of Ecclesiastes 4, and I feel that life is lonely and lost, I have those friends I can lean on. I have those friends who I know love me and are living for me. Find those friends, but better yet, be those friends. It is important that when we read passages about friendship, we do not have I need to look for a good friend focus. We need to have a focus that says, I'm going to be that good friend, because it is a command from God. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love others as God commands it. This then leads us to the inward application. And for this we're going to turn to John 16, 29 through 32. John 16:29 reads, His disciples said, Lo, now you are speaking plainly and are not using a figure of speech. Now we know that you know all things and have no need for anyone to question you. By this we believe that you came from God. This is one of the first utterances by the disciples saying, We live for you, God. We love you. We're here for you. We understand what you are saying. We know that you are the Son of God and Son of Man. We understand that you are the Messiah, the Christ, and we're here for you in the good times, in the hard times. We're here for you. And then Jesus answered them, Do you now believe? Behold, an hour is coming and has already come for you to be scattered, each to his own home, and to leave me alone. Jesus here is saying that I will be alone. And it is a reminder to us that I said earlier in Ecclesiastes 4 that your friends will leave you, your friends will fail you. Your friends will fall short, and you will have those times when you are bitterly and utterly alone. And Jesus had that moment. From the moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where the disciples fell asleep while he was praying, to the moment of his death on the cross, and through the day of his death on that Saturday, all the way to that Sunday on his resurrection, he was alone. No one was there. All of his friends had failed him. Everyone had left him behind. As he stood in front of the Pharisees and was mocked by them, none of his friends were there. Peter denied him. As he was crucified, only a few of the disciples were there. Most of them had left. And when he rose again, they were not waiting for him, knowing that he would come out, but no, they weren't even there. Rather, it was not until he came back to them that his friends, the disciples, were there for them. To understand the disciples as followers is good, but to understand them as friends of Jesus is important, because Jesus was the Son of Man and he experienced the epitome of loneliness. This is the inward application. You will find times where you are alone, where you are consumed by the evils of a fallen world, when you feel oppressed, when you feel broken, when you feel that work is pointless, and you feel that all of your good rewards for your work are pointless and meaningless. You will feel alone. But Jesus does not stop here. He says here, "And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me." This is the inward application. Know that if you are a Christian, God loves you, and God is for you, and He alone is there in the hardest of times. Then when all of your friends have failed you, good friends who are called to have, all of them fail you, God is there. He is the best friend. He is the greatest friend. And He is the one who is there when all others have failed you. We love because He first loved us. We try to build these friendships understanding that God is the perfect friend. Going back to the garden, Adam, before he had Eve, had a friendship with God, and that friendship came first, and that friendship was perfect. And then Eve came in, and that friendship was made even more perfect, that Adam and Eve were friends, and God was friends with them, and they were in perfect part of the Trinity, in love and harmony and friendship. But in the fall, friendship was broken, hard work was created, and death was initiated. But the way that we get through a fallen world is to love others as God commanded it, and to reinstate that love with God, and understand that God loves us when we live for Him, and to understand that in a fallen world the way to get through it is to try to get back to Eden, to live in sanctification, living for God with a heavenly focus, understanding that we need friends in this fallen world, and that labor for God is only possible when we live for other people, we live for God, and we live with other people. Do not be the lone wolf Christian. Rather, love others as God commands it, and know that God loves you, and may that cause you to love other people more. Let us build Christian friendships so that we can survive a fallen world, and so that we can live for God.